The room went silent when the choir director cut her off mid-note, eyes cold, voice sharp. In front of everyone, she said the words that burned deeper than rejection. "Your voice doesn't fit here." A black girl stood frozen on the stage, humiliated, talent dismissed with a smile dressed as standards. What no one knew was that this moment was being watched, recorded and carried far beyond that room. And when Christmas came, the same voice they tried to erase would force them to answer for everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The choir room smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old sheet music, a space dressed up for the season, but heavy with history. Red and gold ribbons hung unevenly along the bulletin boards, and a crooked paper wreath framed the whiteboard, where past competition trophies were listed in careful marker. For most students, this room represented belonging, harmony, and the promise of being heard together. For Aaliyah Brooks, standing just inside the doorway with her audition folder pressed against her chest, it felt like stepping onto unfamiliar ground, where every sound she made would be judged before it was even understood. Aaliyah had prepared for this moment for weeks. She had practiced late into the night while her mother slept on the couch after double shifts, humming softly at first and then letting her voice rise when she was sure no neighbors would complain. Music had always been the one place where she felt whole. Not perfect, not effortless, but real. Her voice carried warmth and depth that came from years of singing alone, filling quiet spaces that no one else seemed to notice. Walking into the choir room, she expected nerves. She expected scrutiny. What she did not expect was the stillness that met her, the way conversation seemed to die as soon as she crossed the threshold. At the front of the room stood Margaret Holloway, the choir director, clipboard tucked neatly under her arm, posture straight and practiced. She had the look of someone who had spent decades being obeyed without ever needing to raise her voice. Her smile, when it appeared, was polite but distant, the kind reserved for formality rather than warmth. Around her sat a handful of students waiting their turn, their expressions a mix of boredom and quiet confidence. Aaliyah noticed how quickly eyes moved over her and then away, as if they had already categorized her before she had even opened her mouth. Margaret gestured toward the marked spot on the floor without speaking. Aaliyah stepped forward, the sound of her shoes against the linoleum echoing louder than she expected. She took a breath, grounding herself the way she always did, reminding herself that this was about the music, not the room, not the people. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the sheet music, but her voice, when it came, was steady, rich, controlled. It filled the space in a way that felt natural to her, wrapping around the decorations and bouncing off the walls that had absorbed so many voices before her. For a brief moment, the room was quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if the sound had demanded attention. Aaliyah sang with restraint, letting emotion rise slowly rather than forcing it, trusting the song to speak for itself. She did not oversing or reach for approval. She simply sang the way she always had, with honesty shaped by experience rather than instruction. When the final note faded, she held her posture, waiting, heart pounding but hopeful. This was the part where someone usually nodded, smiled, or at least acknowledged what had just happened. Instead, there was silence. Margaret looked down at her clipboard, tapping her pen once, then twice, as if measuring something invisible. The other students avoided Aaliyah's gaze, suddenly very interested in their own shoes or the decorations on the wall. The quiet stretched, becoming uncomfortable, then sharp. Aaliyah felt her confidence begin to thin, replaced by the familiar ache of uncertainty. She had sung well, she knew she had, but the room did not respond the way she had imagined, and that disconnect settled in her chest like a warning. Margaret finally looked up, her expression carefully neutral. She thanked Aaliyah for coming, her tone professional, almost rehearsed. She mentioned technical things first, breath control, tone quality, using language that sounded like praise but carried no warmth. Then her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in consideration, as if Aaliyah were an object that did not quite fit into a designated space. The pause before the next sentence felt deliberate, weighted. She said that the choir had a very specific sound, a tradition they worked hard to maintain. She explained that auditions were not just about talent, but about blending, about cohesion. As she spoke, Aaliyah realized the words were drifting further and further away from the performance that had just happened, becoming something abstract and unreachable. This was not about how she sang, it was about something else, something unspoken, that hovered between them. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Margaret said, calmly and without malice, that Aaliyah's voice did not fit what they were looking for. The words landed softly, but their impact was anything but gentle. Aaliyah felt heat rise to her face, a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. She searched Margaret's expression for clarification, for any hint that this was about technique or improvement, but found only finality. Around her the room seemed to shrink, decorations blurred. The sense of possibility she had carried in with her dissolved into something heavy and hollow. Aaliyah nodded because that was what she had been taught to do in moments like this. Be respectful. Don't make it uncomfortable. She thanked Margaret for her time, her voice quieter now, carefully controlled to keep from cracking. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of another student being waved forward, someone whose presence already felt expected, welcomed. The contrast stung more than the rejection itself. Walking out of the choir room, Aaliyah felt the weight of eyes on her back. Not curious, not sympathetic, just relieved. The hallway outside was louder, filled with lockers slamming and distant laughter, but she felt disconnected from it all. The rejection echoed in her mind, not as a critique but as a verdict. Your voice doesn't fit. The phrase repeated itself, morphing with each replay, sounding less about music and more about her. She paused near the end of the hallway, gripping her audition folder tighter than before. Part of her wanted to cry, to let the disappointment spill out where no one could see. Another part felt something sharper, more dangerous than sadness. Confusion mixed with anger, not explosive but steady, the kind that asks questions with no easy answers. What exactly didn't fit? The room? The tradition? Or the image of who was supposed to stand on that marked spot? As she stood there trying to collect herself, a door down the hall cracked open. Voices drifted out, muffled but distinct enough to catch fragments. Margaret's voice was among them, lighter now, less measured. Aaliyah didn't mean to listen, but her name floated through the air, followed by a comment about maintaining the choir's image for the holidays. The words were not cruel, but they were revealing, confirming what Aaliyah had already begun to suspect. Her rejection was never just about her voice. The realization settled in slowly, changing the shape of her hurt into something more complex. This was not a simple disappointment to move past. It was a moment that would linger, reshape how she saw the school, the program, and herself. As Aaliyah finally walked away, the sounds of the hallway closing in around her, she did not yet know how deeply this single sentence would alter her path, but she knew with unsettling clarity that this was not the end of the story. Aaliyah did not leave the building right away. The hallway outside the choir room carried a different weight now, each sound sharper, each laugh more distant. She leaned against a trophy case, pretending to scroll on her phone while her thoughts raced. The sentence Margaret Holloway had delivered so cleanly continued to echo, reshaping itself with every breath. It sounded reasonable on the surface, almost kind in its restraint, yet it gnawed at her with a persistence she could not ignore. Standards, tradition, words that seemed harmless until they were used to quietly close doors. She replayed the audition in her mind, not searching for mistakes but for clues. Her pitch had been steady, her control deliberate. She had sung with the kind of emotional discipline that teachers often praised in others. If this were truly about musical cohesion, there would have been notes to improve, suggestions, an invitation to adapt. Instead, there had been a wall, smooth, professional, and absolute. The realization that there had been no path forward unsettled her more than the rejection itself. As students passed by, Aaliyah noticed how differently they carried themselves. Some moved with the comfort of expectation, others with anxious ambition. She wondered how many of them had been told their voices fit before they even sang. How many had been shaped to match an image they did not have to fight for. The choir, she knew, was celebrated by the school, showcased at assemblies and holiday events as a symbol of unity. Yet unity, she was beginning to understand, often came with conditions. Margaret's explanation echoed again, this time stripped of its polish. The choir had a sound they had cultivated for years. A sound parents expected. A sound judges rewarded. Aaliyah wondered who that sound was built around, whose voices had been considered the default from the beginning. The thought unsettled her because it forced her to confront something she had sensed before but never named. Talent in this space was not judged in isolation. It was filtered through comfort, familiarity, and an unspoken hierarchy. She pushed herself off the trophy case, deciding it was time to leave. Lingering only made the rejection feel heavier. As she moved toward the exit, she passed a side hallway that led back toward the choir office. The door was partially open, light spilling out into the corridor. She slowed instinctively, not out of curiosity at first, but because she recognized Margaret's voice again, softer now, free of the measured authority she used with students. The words floated out casually, carried by laughter that sounded relieved, rather than cruel. Margaret was speaking to another faculty member, someone Aaliyah recognized as part of the school's arts committee. They were discussing the auditions, their tone relaxed, almost dismissive. Aaliyah meant to keep walking, but her name surfaced again, pulling her attention back like a tether. Margaret remarked that some voices, while technically impressive, could disrupt the choir's balance. She mentioned the importance of maintaining a certain image, especially for the Christmas season, when parents, donors, and district officials would be watching. The other voice agreed, adding that audiences had expectations, and it was easier not to challenge them. The conversation carried an ease that made Aaliyah's chest tighten. This was not an isolated decision, or a personal misjudgment. It was a shared understanding. What stung most was how casually they spoke, as if the exclusion were a logistical concern, rather than a human one. There was no mention of growth or mentorship, no curiosity about how a different voice might elevate the choir rather than threaten it. Aaliyah realized then that fit was a euphemism, a shield that allowed them to avoid naming what they were actually protecting. Comfort, predictability, a narrow definition of excellence. She stood frozen, heart pounding, as the conversation continued. Margaret joked lightly about how some students did better in other musical spaces, suggesting solos or community programs, places conveniently outside the school's spotlight. It was framed as kindness, as offering alternatives, but Aaliyah heard it clearly now. Inclusion was conditional, extended only when it did not require the institution to change. The twist came quietly, buried in an offhand comment. Margaret mentioned that a donor's daughter would be joining the choir this year, someone whose voice perfectly matched the tone they wanted. The implication was clear. Decisions had been made long before auditions began. Aaliyah's performance, no matter how strong, had been an interruption rather than a possibility. The audition had been a formality, a performance of fairness rather than its practice. Aaliyah stepped back before she could be seen, her pulse loud in her ears. The hallway felt different now, charged with a clarity that hurt more than confusion ever had. She understood, with unsettling precision, that her rejection was not personal, but systemic, that knowledge did not comfort her. It sharpened the pain, turning it into something heavier, something that demanded reckoning. As she finally left the building, the winter air hit her face, cold and bracing. She welcomed it, letting it ground her. Her phone buzzed with a notification she ignored, her mind too full to focus on anything else. The school behind her looked the same as it always had, brick and glass reflecting the fading afternoon light. Yet she felt as though she had crossed an invisible line, seeing it now for what it was rather than what it claimed to be. On the bus ride home, Aaliyah stared out the window, watching the city blur past. The humiliation of the audition had evolved into something more complex, a mix of anger, resolve, and a quiet determination she did not yet know how to name. She thought about her mother, about the sacrifices that had shaped her voice long before any choir director judged it. She thought about the countless hours spent singing into the quiet, believing that effort alone could open doors. By the time she reached her stop, one truth had settled firmly in her mind. This was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a deeper conflict, one that extended beyond a single audition or director. As she stepped off the bus, her phone buzzed again, this time with a message that would soon pull her into an unexpected spotlight, one that neither she nor Margaret Holloway could control. By the next morning, the school had already returned to its carefully rehearsed rhythm. Posters celebrating diversity lined the hallways, their colors bright and intentional. Slogans about unity and inclusion taped neatly beside photos from last year's multicultural assembly. Aaliyah walked past them slowly, her backpack heavier than usual, each step accompanied by a quiet bitterness she could not shake. The irony was impossible to miss. This was a place that spoke fluently about representation, yet seemed unwilling to practice it when it demanded discomfort or change. She moved through the corridors with a new awareness, noticing things she had once brushed past without question. The honors choir display near the main office showcased framed photos of past performances, rows of smiling faces frozen in polished harmony. Aaliyah paused there longer than she meant to, studying the images. The sameness was subtle but undeniable. Different years, different outfits, but the same narrow range of voices imagined behind those smiles. She wondered how many talented students had stood where she stood now, told in softer language that they did not quite belong. In her first class of the day, The teacher launched into a discussion about cultural appreciation in the arts, praising the school's commitment to inclusivity. Aaliyah listened quietly, her hands folded on her desk, the words washing over her without landing. The conversation felt hollow, detached from reality, like a performance meant to reassure rather than challenge. When the teacher asked if anyone wanted to share their experiences, Aaliyah felt a flicker of temptation, quickly extinguished by the weight of what she already knew. Speaking up required trust in a system that had just shown her its limits. Between classes, whispers followed her. Not cruel, not overt, but curious. News of auditions always traveled fast, especially when outcomes surprised people. A classmate leaned over at her locker, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. She said she had heard Aaliyah sing once in middle school, and didn't understand why she hadn't made the choir. The comment was meant as comfort, but it landed awkwardly, highlighting the gap between perception and decision. Aaliyah offered a small smile, unwilling to explain something that felt too heavy for a hallway conversation. As the day unfolded, subtle signals reinforced what the audition had already suggested. An announcement over the intercom praised the choir's upcoming Christmas performance, emphasizing tradition and excellence. Teachers spoke proudly about how the event brought the community together every year. Aaliyah felt invisible in those moments, as though her exclusion were not just accepted, but necessary to preserve a narrative everyone else benefited from. The school's celebration of diversity seemed conditional, extended only when it fit neatly into existing structures. At lunch, Aaliyah sat with friends who tried, in their own ways, to lift her spirits. One joked that the choir director was out of touch. Another suggested she look for opportunities outside school. Their support was genuine, but it skimmed the surface of what she was feeling. This was not just about missing out on an activity. It was about being measured against standards she had no part in shaping, standards that quietly favored some while sidelining others. The realization settled deeper with each passing hour. The unexpected twist came during her last class, when a guidance counselor visited to speak about extracurricular opportunities and college preparation. The counselor highlighted how participation in programs like the choir strengthened applications, opening doors to scholarships and recommendations. As she spoke, her eyes flicked briefly toward Aaliyah, lingering just long enough to register recognition. It was subtle, but Aaliyah caught it. The exclusion from the choir was not a small thing. It had ripple effects, consequences that extended beyond the stage and into her future. When the final bell rang, Aaliyah lingered, packing her bag slowly. She felt a pull to leave quickly, to escape the building and its contradictions, but something held her back. As she stepped into the hallway, she heard raised voices ahead, sharp enough to cut through the usual end-of-day noise. Students clustered near the lockers, drawn by tension. Aaliyah moved closer, her curiosity outweighing her caution. At the center of the small crowd stood a younger student, her face flushed, eyes glossy with unshed tears. A teacher hovered nearby, speaking in a tight, controlled tone about rules and appropriateness. The student's offense, it seemed, was wearing her natural hair loose instead of pulled back, a violation of the choir's presentation standards. Aaliyah felt a jolt of recognition. Different situation, same logic. Standards framed as neutral, enforced unevenly, always landing hardest on the same people. As the teacher walked away, muttering about professionalism, Aaliyah caught the younger student's eye. There was a shared understanding there, unspoken but immediate. This was bigger than one audition, bigger than one voice. The bias she had encountered in the choir room threaded through the school in quiet, persistent ways, shaping experiences long before anyone dared to name it. Aaliyah turned to leave, her mind racing, when she nearly collided with Margaret Holloway herself, emerging from a side corridor. Their eyes met, and for a split second, the director's composed expression faltered. She recovered quickly, offering a polite nod, as if nothing had happened. But Aaliyah noticed the tension beneath it, the awareness that something had shifted. The hallway felt charged, the air thick with unspoken truths. As Margaret moved past, she said something under her breath to another teacher about maintaining standards and avoiding distractions. The words were vague, but their meaning was clear. Aaliyah stood there, heart pounding, realizing that the bias she faced was not isolated or accidental. It was reinforced, protected, and normalized by the very people tasked with guiding students forward. The hallway encounter left her shaken, but it also ignited something new. This was no longer just her story. It was a pattern, one that reached far beyond the choir room and into the fabric of the school itself. As Aaliyah walked toward the exit, she felt the weight of that realization settle in. knowing that what she had uncovered was only the surface, and that confronting it would come at a cost she had not yet begun to imagine. That evening, the house felt quieter than usual, as if it too sensed the weight Aaliyah carried inside. The familiar creak of the front door closing behind her sounded louder than it should have, echoing down the narrow hallway. She slipped off her shoes and placed her backpack by the wall with deliberate care, avoiding the kitchen where the light was on, and her mother's voice drifted through a phone call. Aaliyah was not ready for questions yet, not ready to explain a rejection that felt too complicated to put into simple words. She retreated to her room, a small space filled with reminders of who she was when no one else was watching. Posters of singers she admired lined one wall, their faces watching over her like silent witnesses. A second-hand keyboard sat beneath the window, its keys worn smooth from years of practice. This room had always been her refuge, the place where her voice mattered without needing permission. Tonight, though, it felt smaller, the walls closing in with every thought she tried to push away. Aaliyah sat on the edge of her bed, replaying the day from beginning to end. The posters about diversity, the whispers in the hallway, the younger student being corrected for existing outside an unspoken mold. Each moment layered itself onto the last, forming a heavy, tangled knot of emotion. She wondered when talent had stopped being enough, or if it ever truly had been. The doubt crept in quietly, asking questions she hated answering. Maybe her voice really didn't belong there. Maybe she had misjudged herself all along. When her mother finally knocked and stepped into the room, the shift in energy was immediate. She could always tell when something was wrong, even before words were exchanged. She asked how auditions went, her tone careful, hopeful, but restrained. Aaliyah hesitated, then offered a simplified version of the truth, saying she didn't make the choir and that the director said it wasn't a good fit. Her mother's face tightened, not in disappointment, but in recognition. She had heard variations of that phrase before, in different contexts, aimed at different dreams. Her mother sat beside her, listening without interrupting, as Aaliyah tried to explain what it felt like. The confusion, the quiet humiliation, the sense that something larger than music had been at play. When Aaliyah finally fell silent, her mother spoke gently, reminding her that being overlooked did not erase her ability. She said that the world had a habit of rejecting what it did not want to understand, especially when it came from voices that challenged comfort. The words were meant to reassure, but they also carried an unspoken truth. This would not be the last time Aaliyah faced something like this. Later, alone again, Aaliyah turned to the keyboard, pressing a few keys softly, letting familiar chords fill the space. Music still responded to her. It always did, yet even that comfort felt fragile now, tainted by the question she could not silence. What if her voice was powerful only in private? What if it was never meant for the stages she dreamed of? The thought frightened her more than rejection itself. As the night deepened, sleep refused to come. Aaliyah lay on her bed, phone glowing in the dark as she scrolled aimlessly, trying to distract herself. Her feed was filled with polished performances, perfectly lit stages, and singers whose journeys seemed effortless from the outside. Each video tightened the knot in her chest. Comparison crept in, whispering that maybe those voices fit because they were supposed to, because the world had already made room for them. Then, almost accidentally, she stumbled onto something unexpected. A recommended video appeared, a clip from a regional Christmas music competition she vaguely recognized. The description mentioned open submissions, independent entries judged anonymously before live performances. Aaliyah's heart skipped. She tapped into the comments, scrolling quickly, noticing how people praised voices they had never seen, focusing only on sound, emotion, authenticity, no faces, no school names, no images to filter talent through bias. She followed the link to the competition's page, reading the rules slowly, carefully. Submissions were due soon. The risk was immediate and real. If she entered, she would be putting her voice into a space far larger than her school, opening herself up to scrutiny without the protection of anonymity forever. If she failed, the rejection would feel louder, more public. The thought made her stomach twist, yet the possibility lingered, shimmering with both hope and fear. Aaliyah imagined Margaret Holloway's composed expression, the certainty with which she had dismissed her. She imagined the hallway encounter, the casual reinforcement of standards that excluded without apology. This competition offered something different, a chance to be heard without being seen first. The idea felt dangerous precisely because it was fair. Her finger hovered over the submission guidelines, her mind racing through every possible outcome. Success could validate everything she believed about herself. Failure could cement the doubts already gnawing at her confidence. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, heavier than any audition room silence. This was no longer about proving the choir director wrong. It was about deciding whether she trusted her voice enough to risk everything she had left. As the clock ticked past midnight, Aaliyah closed her phone, heart pounding. She wasn't ready to decide yet, but the door had been opened, somewhere beyond the walls of her room, beyond the school that had quietly rejected her. An opportunity waited, one that could redefine her future, or leave her questioning it forever. And as she stared into the darkness, the question that haunted her was no longer whether her voice fit, but whether she was brave enough to let it be heard at all. Aaliyah woke to the soft vibration of her phone on the nightstand, a restless, insistent hum that cut through the quiet of early morning. She reached for it without fully opening her eyes, expecting a routine notification, maybe a reminder or a group chat message from school. Instead, the screen lit up with a string of alerts stacked one after another, names she recognized mixed with usernames she did not. Her chest tightened before she even read them. Something had shifted while she slept. The first message was from a classmate she barely spoke to, asking if the video was really her. Another followed, this one cautious, telling her she sounded incredible, and asking where it had been recorded. Aaliyah sat up slowly, her pulse quickening as she scrolled. Confusion gave way to dread when she opened a link, embedded in one of the messages. The page loaded, and there it was. A short clip, grainy and dimly lit, unmistakably her voice filling the speakers. She recognized it immediately. It was a recording from months ago, taken late at night in her room, when she had been practicing quietly and sent a snippet to a friend she trusted, someone who had promised it would stay private. The angle was unflattering, the lighting uneven, but the voice was raw and unguarded, layered with emotion she had never intended for strangers to hear. Her stomach dropped. This was never meant to leave her phone, let alone circulate beyond a single conversation. The comments beneath the video were multiplying in real time. Some were simple, praising the sound without context. Others asked questions: who she was, where she had learned to sing, why she wasn't already performing somewhere. A few speculated about her background, making assumptions that made her skin prickle. The video had been reposted by an account known for sharing undiscovered talent, its caption vague but enticing, framing her as a mystery voice found in the quiet corners of the internet. Aaliyah felt exposed, caught between pride and panic. Part of her wanted to shut it all down, to demand the video be taken down, and retreat back into the safety of anonymity. Another part, quieter but persistent, felt a flicker of validation she hadn't expected. Strangers were responding to her voice without knowing her name, her school, or the labels that had followed her through hallways. They were reacting to the sound alone. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from the friend who had originally received the recording. The apology came quickly, layered with guilt and defensiveness. They explained that they had shared it with someone else, who had promised not to repost it, and then it had spiraled beyond anyone's control. Aaliyah read the message twice, the words blurring together. There was no undoing this now. The damage, whatever form it would take, was already done. At school, the whispers grew louder. Phones were held a little lower. Conversations paused when she passed. Some classmates looked at her with new curiosity, others with thinly veiled judgment. A teacher mentioned the importance of digital responsibility during morning announcements. Her tone pointed enough to feel personal. Aaliyah kept her head down, feeling as though her private world had been pulled into public view without her consent. During lunch, she sat quietly, scrolling through the comments again despite telling herself not to. Amid the praise were criticisms too. People dissecting her tone, suggesting what kind of singer she should be, debating whether her voice belonged to gospel soul or something more palatable. The categorization felt familiar, another attempt to place her into a box she had not chosen. Yet even in that discomfort, the reach of the video was undeniable. It was spreading faster than she could process. The unexpected twist came late that afternoon, when a new notification appeared, different from the rest. It was a direct message from an account that did not look like a fan page or a random user. The profile was sparse but verified, its bio referencing a regional music foundation connected to performance showcases and competitions. Aaliyah's heart skipped. She hesitated before opening the message, a sense of unease settling in alongside cautious hope. The message was brief, but deliberate. The sender said they had come across the video and recognized the quality immediately. They asked if she would be willing to talk, to discuss opportunities that aligned with her voice. The wording was professional, But something about it felt personal, as though the person on the other end understood the stakes of reaching out. Aaliyah reread it several times, her mind racing through possibilities. Was this real interest or just another form of exploitation dressed up as opportunity? She showed the message to her mother that evening, watching her reaction closely. Her mother's expression shifted from concern to guarded curiosity, then settled into something resolute. She asked questions about the account, the foundation, the intentions behind the outreach. She reminded Aaliyah that attention, especially sudden attention, often came with expectations and risks, but she also acknowledged what this could mean. How rare it was for talent to be noticed without being filtered through institutional bias first. As night fell, Aaliyah found herself alone again, the house quiet except for the hum of distant traffic. She stared at the message, thumb hovering over the reply field. The video had already changed how people saw her, for better or worse. Responding could amplify that change, pushing her further into a spotlight she had not chosen, but could no longer avoid. Ignoring it felt safer, but also like turning away from a door she had been waiting for her entire life. She thought of the choir room, the silence that had swallowed her song, the sentence that had dismissed her so easily. She thought of the competition she had discovered the night before, the possibility of being heard without being judged by appearances. This message felt connected to all of it, another thread pulling her toward a future that demanded courage as much as talent. With a steadying breath, Aaliyah began to type, aware that whatever she said next could alter the course of her story. She had no way of knowing that the person on the other end already knew far more about her voice and her school than she realized, or that their decision to intervene would soon force the truth into a public reckoning no one was prepared for. The response Aaliyah sent that night was careful, measured, written and rewritten, until it sounded neither desperate nor dismissive. When she finally pressed send, the message left her with a hollow feeling in her chest, the kind that comes from stepping into uncertainty without knowing whether the ground will hold. She placed her phone face down on the bed, as if distance might quiet the anxiety building inside her. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by fragments of thought about voices being heard, taken, misunderstood, or used. By morning the reply had arrived. The message was longer this time, warmer but still professional. The sender introduced himself as Daniel Mercer, a vocal coach and consultant affiliated with several regional performance circuits, including the Christmas competition Aaliyah had discovered online. He explained that he had not only heard the clip but had replayed it multiple times, struck by the emotional discipline in her voice rather than just its strength. He said voices like hers were rare, not because they were loud or flashy, but because they carried lived experience in a way that could not be taught. Reading his words, Aaliyah felt something unfamiliar loosen in her chest. Daniel did not promise fame or instant success. Instead, he offered guidance. He asked questions about her training, her environment, and most pointedly, whether she felt supported where she was. The question lingered long after she finished reading. Supported was not a word she would have used for the past few weeks. Seen, maybe. Judged, certainly. But supported implied investment, and that was something she had not felt from the systems designed to nurture her talent. Their conversations moved slowly at first, exchanging messages that grew longer and more personal over time. Daniel shared stories of singers he had worked with, many of whom had been overlooked by schools and institutions that claimed neutrality, while quietly favoring comfort. He did not frame their experiences as tragedies, but as patterns, ones that repeated until someone disrupted them. Aaliyah listened, absorbing the validation that came from hearing her feelings articulated by someone who had no stake in minimizing them. What surprised her most was where the encouragement came from. Beyond Daniel, a local music blogger reached out, asking permission to feature her anonymously in a piece about undiscovered voices online. A former student from another school messaged her, sharing how they had been discouraged from pursuing music because they didn't fit the sound, only to find success elsewhere. Each message carried a different tone, but together they formed a chorus of recognition. These were not institutions. They were individuals, operating outside official systems, offering support without condition. At school, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Teachers acknowledged the viral attention obliquely, congratulating students on their achievements without naming her. The administration remained silent, as if ignoring the situation might make it disappear. The choir director, Margaret Holloway, carried on as usual, rehearsals intensifying as the Christmas performance approached. The institution closed ranks, maintaining its polished image while Aaliyah's voice traveled far beyond its walls. Daniel eventually suggested a call. Hearing his voice made everything feel more real, more immediate. He spoke with clarity, not flattery, outlining possibilities Aaliyah had never considered. He mentioned the Christmas competition again, emphasizing how its blind submission process existed precisely because of story like hers. Then he said something that made her breath catch. He suggested that if she were serious about reclaiming her narrative, she should not stay silent about where she had been rejected. The suggestion unsettled her. Speaking openly meant confrontation, not just with individuals, but with the system itself. Aaliyah had learned early how risky that could be. Daniel acknowledged the fear, explaining that exposure was a double-edged sword. It could invite backlash as easily as support. But he also pointed out that her story, paired with undeniable talent, had the power challenge assumptions that institutions relied on to remain unexamined. Their conversation ended with a pause, Daniel giving her space rather than pressure. He said he would support whatever decision she made, whether she chose anonymity or visibility. That night, Aaliyah sat with the weight of that choice. She thought about the younger student she had seen in the hallway, corrected for her hair. She thought about the donor's daughter whose place in the choir had been quietly secured. Silence suddenly felt like complicity, even if unintentional. The bold suggestion came the next day. Unexpectedly, Daniel sent her a draft email he had written but not sent, addressed to the organizers of the Christmas competition. In it, he recommended Aaliyah not only as a contestant but as a featured performer, suggesting that her story be acknowledged publicly if she advanced. He included her school's name, the choir program, and the exact phrase she had been told. "Your voice doesn't fit." Seeing the words in writing made her stomach drop. Submitting that email would put her directly back in the path of Margaret Holloway. There would be no hiding behind anonymity if the story gained traction. The choir director would recognize herself immediately, as would the administration that had allowed her judgment to stand unchallenged. Aaliyah imagined the fallout meetings, denials, carefully worded statements about standards and misunderstandings. The thought was terrifying, but it was also clarifying. For the first time since the audition, Aaliyah felt a sense of agency. The support she had received did not ask her to shrink or adapt. It asked her to stand where she was and be heard. Institutions had failed her quietly, but people outside them were offering something far more powerful: belief without prerequisites. She told Daniel she needed time. He understood. Yet as she stared at the unsent email, later that night, she realized time itself was a decision. Every day she waited, allowed the school's version of excellence to go unchallenged, allowed her story to be framed by others rather than claimed by herself. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from a classmate she barely knew. They thanked her for not backing down, even though Aaliyah hadn't done anything publicly yet. The assumption caught her off guard, but it also revealed something important. People were watching, waiting. Aaliyah looked at the email one more time, finger hovering over the send button, fully aware that pressing it would pull her back into the very system that had dismissed her. But on her own terms, and as the screen glowed in the darkness, she understood that the next move would force a confrontation she could no longer avoid. The announcement came over the intercom just after second period, its cheerful tone clashing sharply with the tension it stirred inside Aaliyah. The principal's voice carried an enthusiasm reserved for moments the school liked to showcase, moments meant to affirm its reputation rather than challenge it. He spoke about tradition, excellence, and pride, about how the annual Christmas music competition had been elevated this year with judges from outside the district, industry professionals, alumni, donors, people whose opinions carried weight beyond the school's walls. As his words echoed through the classroom, Aaliyah felt her shoulders stiffen. Around her, students exchanged excited looks. The choir members in particular straightened in their seats, already imagining the spotlight, the applause, the validation that came with being chosen to represent the school. The competition had always been important, but this year it was framed as something bigger, something that could open doors. For Aaliyah, the announcement reopened a wound that had barely begun to scab over. Christmas music, outside judges, visibility. Everything about it circled back to the audition room, and the sentence that had quietly dismissed her. The principal emphasized that participation would be selective, reinforcing the idea that only the best, the most fitting, would be put forward. Aaliyah's classmates glanced at her instinctively, some with sympathy, others with curiosity sharpened by the recent attention her voice had received online. She kept her gaze fixed on her desk, listening as if from a distance. The competition was framed as an honor, but she heard the subtext clearly. The school would choose voices that upheld its image, not ones that complicated it. By lunchtime, the buzz had spread. Posters appeared near the main office, announcing rehearsal schedules and audition reminders. Margaret Holloway stood near the choir room doors, speaking animatedly with students, her confidence restored now that the institution's priorities aligned with her authority. She spoke about precision and presentation, about how outside judges expected a certain standard. Aaliyah watched from across the hallway, noting how easily Margaret moved within this space, how secure she seemed in the knowledge that the system would support her choices. The tension followed Aaliyah into the afternoon. She felt caught between two worlds, the one that had rejected her, and the one that had begun to recognize her voice. Daniel's words echoed in her mind, reminding her that institutions often revealed their values most clearly when pressure was applied. This competition was pressure. It brought scrutiny, not just from parents and students, but from people who did not share the school's internal biases. The thought was unsettling, and strangely hopeful all at once. After school, Aaliyah found herself lingering near the choir room again, not out of longing but out of necessity. She needed to understand how this competition worked, what rules governed participation. As students filtered out, she approached the bulletin board where guidelines were posted. Her eyes scanned the text quickly at first, then more carefully. Eligibility requirements, submission deadlines, performance categories. It all looked familiar, until one line stopped her cold. Independent submissions were allowed. The rule was tucked neatly between paragraphs, almost an afterthought. It stated that while the school would officially submit its choir, individual students could also submit solo performances directly to the competition committee, provided they met certain criteria. The catch was subtle but significant. These submissions would be reviewed separately, without school endorsement, judged solely on performance quality before any affiliation was considered. Aaliyah's heart began to race. This was the loophole Daniel had hinted at without naming, an opening that existed on paper but was rarely used, perhaps intentionally overlooked. It bypassed the gatekeepers, allowing voices to enter the competition without being filtered through school approval. It was fair in theory, dangerous in practice. She took a photo of the guidelines, hands trembling slightly. The possibility felt almost unreal. This was not a chance to join the choir. It was something more disruptive. A chance to stand alongside them without belonging to them. To be judged by the same outsiders. Margaret Holloway trusted to validate her standards. The irony was sharp enough to hurt. As Aaliyah turned to leave, she heard footsteps behind her. Margaret's voice followed, light but edged with curiosity. She asked if Aaliyah was interested in the competition. The question sounded innocent, but the timing was too precise to be accidental. Aaliyah met her gaze, choosing her words carefully. She said she was just reading the guidelines. Margaret smiled, a practiced expression that did not quite reach her eyes, and reminded her that the choir already had a strong lineup this year. The unspoken message hung between them. There was no invitation, no encouragement, only a boundary quietly reinforced. Margaret wished her a good afternoon and walked away, heels clicking decisively down the hallway. Aaliyah stood there, the photo of the rules burning in her pocket, aware that she had just crossed another invisible line. That evening, she shared the discovery with Daniel. His reaction was immediate, and charged with restrained excitement. He explained how rarely schools acknowledged that clause, how independent submissions often came from students who had been sidelined or overlooked. He warned her that using it would likely provoke resistance, not because it broke rules, but because it exposed how selectively those rules were applied. Aaliyah listened, weighing the risks again. Submitting independently would mean standing alone, without institutional backing. It would also mean forcing the school to confront a version of excellence it had chosen not to nurture. The competition announcement had reopened old wounds, but it had also revealed a path forward that did not require permission. Late that night, Aaliyah sat at her desk, the submission portal open on her laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated her face as she filled in the required fields, her name, her school, her category. Each click felt deliberate, irreversible. She paused at the final step, aware that pressing submit would set events in motion she could not control. Somewhere across town, Margaret Holloway was finalizing choir arrangements, confident in the choices she had made. She had no idea that a rule she barely acknowledged was about to place Aaliyah directly back into the competition she believed she controlled. And as Aaliyah hovered over the submit button, she understood that this opening was never meant for her. But that was precisely why it mattered. The confirmation email arrived just before dawn, its subject line plain enough to be overlooked if Aaliyah hadn't been staring at her screen already. She had barely slept, the hours stretching thin as she replayed the moment she pressed submit, wondering whether courage and recklessness, sometimes wore the same face. When she opened the message, there was no celebration in its language, no warmth. It simply stated that her independent submission had been received and accepted for preliminary review, pending verification of eligibility. The formality of it made her breath catch. Accepted meant real. It meant she was in. By the time she reached school, the knowledge sat heavy in her chest, equal parts relief and dread. She moved through the hallways with a heightened awareness, every interaction feeling charged with possibility. Word traveled quickly in a place like this, especially when something disrupted the usual order. It didn't take long for her to notice the shift. Conversations paused when she approached. Teachers' smiles felt thinner, more measured. It was as if her presence now carried a question no one wanted to ask out loud. The resistance was quiet, but unmistakable. In class, a teacher mentioned the competition again, praising the choir's preparation and teamwork, carefully omitting any reference to individual entries. At lunch, a friend leaned in and asked, in a hushed voice, whether it was true she had submitted on her own. The question wasn't accusatory, but it carried surprise, as though Aaliyah had violated an unspoken rule by stepping outside her assigned place. She nodded, watching as curiosity flickered into something closer to unease. Faculty members responded with polite distance. A guidance counselor stopped her briefly in the hallway, congratulating her in a tone that sounded more obligatory than sincere. The counselor reminded her of the importance of balancing ambition with realism, suggesting that independent paths were often more challenging without institutional support. The words were framed as concern, but Aaliyah heard the warning beneath them. She was navigating territory the school preferred, remain theoretical. Margaret Holloway said nothing at first. That silence was louder than any reprimand. Aaliyah noticed how the choir director's posture stiffened when their paths crossed, how her eyes lingered just a moment too long before looking away. It was clear Margaret had been informed. The acceptance of Aaliyah's application had forced an acknowledgement she could not avoid, even if she refused to validate it publicly. The unexpected twist came during rehearsal announcements later that week. The choir gathered in the auditorium, voices warming up as Margaret outlined the upcoming schedule. She spoke about unity, about presenting a cohesive image to the judges. Then, almost casually, she mentioned that any students participating independently were expected to refrain from sharing rehearsal spaces or materials associated with the choir, citing fairness and focus. The statement was vague, but its target was precise. Aaliyah felt the room shift. Heads turned subtly in her direction, curiosity sharpening into judgment. The rule wasn't written anywhere, but it landed with authority. It effectively isolated her, marking her as separate and unforted, and inconvenient. Margaret continued speaking, as if nothing unusual had been said, her tone calm, controlled and final. After rehearsal, a teacher approached Aaliyah privately, suggesting it might be better to keep her participation low profile to avoid confusion. Another hinted that independent entries rarely advanced far, implying that hope itself might be a liability. None of them outright discouraged her, but each comment chipped away at the sense of legitimacy she had fought to claim. The message was consistent. She was allowed to be there, but not welcome. At home, Aaliyah recounted the day to her mother, frustration bleeding through her carefully chosen words. Her mother listened, jaw set, recognizing the pattern immediately. She said that when institutions couldn't deny talent, they often resorted to isolation, making the path so uncomfortable that people chose to step away on their own. The observation stung because it felt accurate. The resistance Aaliyah faced was not overt hostility. It was pressure, applied quietly and persistently. Daniel noticed the shift too. Their calls took on a sharper edge, as he explained how common these tactics were. He encouraged Aaliyah to document everything, to remain professional, to let her performance speak where words failed. He also warned her to expect escalation, not in loud confrontations, but in subtle maneuvers designed to undermine confidence. The warning lingered, unsettling but grounding. The devastating move came days later, disguised as routine administration. A notice went out adjusting the performance order for the competition's preliminary showcase. Independent submissions would perform earlier than scheduled, during a smaller time window, with limited audience presence. The change was justified as logistical efficiency, but the implication was clear: fewer eyes, less impact. Aaliyah's heart sank as she read the update, understanding immediately who had advocated for it. Margaret Holloway had found a way to minimize her without breaking a single rule. The realization cut deeper than outright rejection. This was strategy, executed with precision, leveraging authority while maintaining plausible deniability. Aaliyah felt the familiar surge of doubt rise again, threatening to undo the resolve she had built. Was this what stepping forward always cost? Was excellence only celebrated when it didn't disrupt power? Yet beneath the fear, something else stirred. Anger. Yes, but also clarity. The lengths being taken to contain her presence were proof of its significance. If her voice truly did not fit, it would not require this level of control. As she stared at the revised schedule, Aaliyah understood that the battle was no longer about being included. It was about being impossible to ignore. She closed her laptop slowly, the weight of what lay ahead settling in. The path forward had narrowed, sharpened by resistance, but it was still open. And as she prepared for a performance designed to silence her impact, she had no idea that someone else was already watching closely, ready to disrupt the plan in a way Margaret Holloway could never anticipate. The rehearsal space assigned to Aaliyah was technically a room, but it felt more like a storage area that had been reluctantly repurposed. Folding chairs lined one wall beside stacked music stands that smelled faintly of dust and metal. The overhead lights hummed with a tired insistence, casting a flat glow that offered no warmth. It was far from the auditorium where the choir rehearsed, far from the soundproof room's rows for favored ensembles. The separation was deliberate, though no one had said so outright. This was where independent entries went when the system needed them contained. Aaliyah arrived early every day, carrying her music and a determination that had begun to feel fragile. She warmed up quietly, careful not to disturb anyone passing by, her voice restrained by the awareness that even confidence could be interpreted as defiance now. Each note felt heavier than the last, not because the music was difficult, but because the space itself resisted her presence. Silence pressed in between phrases, reminding her that she was alone in a that had nothing to do with sound. Occasionally she heard the choir through the walls, layers of voices rising together, laughter spilling out during breaks, Margaret's steady direction guiding them toward a unified result. The contrast was sharp and unrelenting. Aaliyah wondered if the isolation was meant to protect focus, or to erode it. She suspected the latter. Without mirrors of affirmation, doubt crept in easily, whispering that maybe this distance was earned, that perhaps she truly was out of place. The pressure intensified as the competition drew closer. Daniel checked in frequently, offering technical notes and encouragement, but even his support could not fully counter the environment she was navigating daily. He reminded her that preparation was not just about perfection, but resilience. Still, when Aaliyah returned to school each morning, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, bracing herself for a day of being seen without being supported. Faculty interactions grew more strained. A rehearsal supervisor stopped by one afternoon, glancing at her setup with thinly veiled impatience. They commented on scheduling conflicts, and reminded her of time limits, emphasizing that independent entries were expected to adhere strictly to guidelines. The tone was polite, but the message was unmistakable. There would be no grace for mistakes. While others were coached through missteps, Aaliyah felt as though any error would confirm the doubts surrounding her participation. Students noticed too. Some avoided her, unsure of how to engage without aligning themselves with controversy. Others offered quiet words of encouragement that felt both kind and cautious, as if support itself carried risk. The isolation was not loud or dramatic. It was subtle, persistent, and exhausting. Aaliyah found herself questioning not just her voice, but her right to occupy space at all. One afternoon, exhaustion caught up with her. In the middle of a difficult passage, her voice wavered, the notes slipping just enough to break her concentration. Frustration surged unexpectedly, sharp and disorienting. She stopped, pressing her palms against the cool metal of the music stand, fighting the urge to cry. This wasn't about technique. It was about being worn down, about carrying the weight of representation alone, while pretending it didn't affect her. The unexpected twist came when another student entered the room, without warning. He was part of the choir, sent by Margaret to retrieve equipment. He paused, listening for a moment as Aaliyah resumed singing, her voice regaining its strength despite the interruption. His expression shifted, surprise giving way to something more complicated. He didn't say anything at first, but when he finally spoke, it was with an awkward honesty that caught her off guard. He admitted he hadn't understood why she wasn't in the choir until now. The comment lingered after he left. Equal parts validation and frustration. Recognition came late, and quietly, offering no tangible change. Aaliyah returned to rehearsing, aware that moments like that, while meaningful, did not alter the structure she was pushing against. The system had already decided how much space she was allowed, and it was not enough. As the week progressed, Rules tightened further. A memo circulated outlining rehearsal protocols, emphasizing approved spaces and supervision requirements. The language was neutral, but Aaliyah recognized the shift immediately. Independent entries were now required to log practice hours and submit recordings for review. The added scrutiny felt punitive, another layer of control designed to keep her contained. Then came the incident. During a late rehearsal, Aaliyah recorded a run-through to review later, careful to keep the volume low. She didn't notice the door had been left slightly ajar. When she finished, a faculty member stood there, arms crossed, expression unreadable. They informed her that recording in the building required prior approval, citing policy. Aaliyah explained calmly that she was practicing for the competition and had not been told of any restriction. The response was immediate and cold. Ignorance of policy, she was told, did not exempt her from consequences. By the next morning, the issue had escalated. A notice appeared in her inbox stating that a review was underway to determine whether her actions violated competition guidelines. The phrasing was careful, legalistic, but the implication was clear. Disqualification was being considered. The isolation that had tested her emotionally now threatened to erase her participation entirely. Aaliyah sat in her assigned rehearsal room, staring at the message, as the hum of the lights grew louder. This was no longer subtle. It was a direct challenge, a test of whether she would fold under pressure or push back against a system determined to remind her of her place. She had followed the rules as she understood them, yet the margin for error had been drawn so tightly around her that even preparation could be framed as misconduct. Her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel, asking if everything was okay. She hesitated before responding, unsure how to explain the feeling of being targeted without sounding defensive. The truth was simple and devastating. The space she occupied was conditional, and the conditions were shifting beneath her feet. As Aaliyah gathered her things to leave, she glanced once more at the door, half expecting someone else to appear with another quiet reprimand. The threat of disqualification hung in the air, unresolved and heavy, and as she stepped into the hallway, she knew that whatever came next would determine not just her place in the competition, but whether her voice would be allowed to exist in this space at all. The night settled in slowly, wrapping the house in a quiet that felt heavier than usual. Christmas lights blinked lazily along the neighboring rooftops, their colors reflected faintly in Aaliyah's bedroom window. It was supposed to be a season of warmth, of music filling familiar spaces, but tonight the silence pressed in with an unforgiving logic. She sat at her desk, shoulders slumped, staring at the email on her laptop as if it might change if she looked long enough. The words remained unchanged, clinical and cautious, outlining the review process, the possibility of disqualification, the reminder that participation was a privilege contingent on compliance. For the first time since all of this had begun, quitting felt reasonable. Her body ached with exhaustion that went beyond lack of sleep. It was the fatigue of being constantly alert, constantly measured, constantly aware that one wrong move could be interpreted as proof she never belonged. The emotional math no longer added up. She had entered this competition to be heard, to reclaim something that had been taken quietly from her. Instead, she had found herself trapped in a different version of the same fight, one where rules bent just enough to keep her off balance. She closed the laptop and leaned back, eyes tracing the familiar cracks in the ceiling. Every argument for walking away lined up neatly in her mind. She could protect herself from further humiliation. She could stop feeling like an inconvenience in spaces that pretended to be fair. She could keep her voice private again, safe from scrutiny, safe from being turned into a battleground. Giving up wasn't failure, she told herself. It was self-preservation. From the living room came the soft murmur of her mother humming as she wrapped gifts, a habit she had carried since Aaliyah was small. The sound drifted down the hallway, gentle and unassuming, stirring something uncomfortable in Aaliyah's chest. Music had always lived in this house, not as performance, but as survival. Songs played while bills were sorted, while exhaustion settled in after long shifts, while hope needed somewhere to rest. The thought made her throat tighten. Her phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Daniel sat unread. She didn't open it right away. She already knew what it would contain. Encouragement, reassurance, belief. All the things that felt too heavy to carry when doubt had settled so deeply. Tonight, belief felt like a burden. Aaliyah stood and crossed the room, pulling open the bottom drawer of her dresser. Inside were things she rarely touched anymore. Old notebooks, programs from middle school concerts, a folded piece of construction paper with uneven handwriting. She hesitated, then picked it up. It was a note she had written years ago. After her first solo at a small church Christmas service, she had been nervous, convinced she would mess up, convinced people would laugh. Instead, she had sung, voice trembling but honest, and afterward an elderly woman she barely knew had squeezed her hands and told her she sounded like truth. Leah remembered that night with startling clarity. The flicker of candles, the way her mother's eyes had filled with tears, not because the performance was perfect, but because it was brave. No one had talked about fitting in then. No one had measured her voice against tradition or image. It had simply been allowed to exist, to fill the space it was given. She sat back on the bed, the memory washing over her, reframing everything she had endured these past weeks. The rejection, the isolation, the scrutiny, they were not signs that her voice lacked value. They were signs that it carried weight, enough to unsettle systems invested in maintaining control. The logic of quitting began to crack, revealing something beneath it that felt uncomfortably like fear masquerading as reason. Her mother knocked softly before entering, holding 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to Aaliyah without comment, and sat beside her, sensing the heaviness without needing it explained. After a long moment, she spoke quietly, saying she had noticed how tired Aaliyah looked, how much she had been carrying alone. She asked gently whether all of this was still worth it. Aaliyah stared into the steam rising from the mug, choosing her words carefully. She admitted that she didn't know anymore, that it felt like every step forward invited another barrier, that sometimes it seemed easier to let go than to keep fighting spaces that clearly did not want her. Her voice shook despite her effort to keep it steady. Her mother listened, nodding slowly. Then she said something that landed harder than any encouragement Daniel had offered. She said that the people who benefit most from unfair systems often look reasonable, even kind, while enforcing them. She said walking away might bring peace in the short term, but it would also leave the story unfinished, defined by someone else's comfort rather than Aaliyah's truth. She reminded her that music had never been about permission in their family. It had always been about expression. The words settled in the room, heavy but grounding. Aaliyah realized that quitting would not erase the harm done to her. It would only ensure that the harm went unchallenged. The memory of that church performance returned, sharper now, carrying with it the understanding that her voice had always been meant to disrupt silence, not retreat from it. She opened her laptop again, not to reread the email, but to pull up the recording she planned to submit. She listened closely, hearing not just notes and phrasing, but resilience layered into every breath. This was not a performance born of approval. It was shaped by rejection, sharpened by pressure, and strengthened by the knowledge that she had already survived worse than disqualification. Her phone buzzed again. This time she opened Daniel's message. It was simple. He said that whatever she decided, she was not wrong, but that the world rarely changed because the right people stepped aside. Aaliyah exhaled slowly, the weight in her chest shifting, rearranging itself into something steadier. As midnight approached, Christmas only hours away, Aaliyah sat alone in her room, decision forming quietly but firmly. She did not yet know how the review would end, whether the system would try again to push her out, but she knew something had changed. The rejection no longer defined her limits. It clarified her purpose, and as she prepared to send a message that would challenge the disqualification review directly, Aaliyah realized that the memory she carried, the one that reminded her why she sang in the first place, was about to collide with the very institution that had tried to silence her, setting the stage for a confrontation no one had anticipated. The auditorium felt different on the morning of the performance, charged with a quiet intensity that had nothing to do with celebration. Rows of seats filled slowly with administrators, parents, visiting judges, and select members of the community whose presence signaled importance. This was not just a school event anymore. It was a display, a carefully curated moment meant to affirm the school's reputation. Aaliyah stood backstage, listening to the low murmur of voices bleeding through the curtains, aware that many of the people out there had already decided what excellence was supposed to look and sound like. She had made it through the review. The investigation into her rehearsal recording had ended without apology. Only a brief notice stating she was cleared to perform under close adherence to guidelines. No acknowledgement of the stress it caused. No recognition of how narrowly she had escaped being erased. Just permission, granted coldly, as if it were generosity rather than obligation. Aaliyah accepted it without comment, understanding now that survival in these spaces often required restraint. Backstage, the choir members moved together in coordinated calm, their matching attire reinforcing unity. Margaret Holloway stood among them, offering last-minute notes with practiced ease, her authority unchallenged. When her eyes flicked briefly toward Aaliyah, there was no hostility, only a cool assessment, as though she were evaluating an unexpected variable she still believed she could contain. Aaliyah felt the familiar tightening in her chest, but steadied herself. This stage was not Margaret's alone. Daniel sat several rows back, visible only because Aaliyah had learned to look for him. His presence grounded her, a reminder that someone in the audience understood what was at stake beyond trophies and applause. Near him sat the judges, their posture attentive but reserved, pens poised over programs. They were professionals, but not immune to assumption. They had read the lineup. They knew which performances were school-endorsed, and which were independent. Context, Aaliyah knew, always colored perception. The principal took the stage first, delivering opening remarks about tradition and excellence, about how music united the community. The words washed over Aaliyah, without landing. She had heard them all before, used to smooth over contradictions rather than address them. As he spoke, her name appeared on the program, listed beneath the choir's performance, set apart by a small but significant label, independent entry. The separation was subtle, but it mattered. When the choir performed, they did exactly what was expected. Their sound was polished, balanced, familiar. Applause followed, warm and assured. Margaret smiled, satisfied, exchanging nods with administrators who recognized their own success reflected back at them. Aaliyah listened carefully, not with resentment, but with focus. She noted the precision, the restraint, the way individuality dissolved into cohesion. It was impressive. It was also exactly what she had been told she could not be part of. Her turn came without ceremony. An announcer read her name, pausing slightly, as if unsure how to frame it. Aaliyah stepped onto the stage alone, the lights brighter than she anticipated, forcing her to blink as the audience came into view. From this angle, she could see everything: the evaluative stillness of the judges, the folded arms of administrators, the curious tilt of heads from audience members who recognized her from the circulating video. She felt exposed, but also strangely calm. There was nowhere left to hide. She stood at the center of the stage, hands relaxed at her sides, the room settling into a quiet that felt heavier than applause. This silence was different from the audition room. It was not dismissive. It was expectant, edged with skepticism. Many out there believed they already knew how this would go. That belief hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Aaliyah closed her eyes briefly, grounding herself in the memory she had carried from the night before. The church, the candles, the truth in her voice. When she opened them again, she inhaled slowly, deeply, allowing the breath to settle not just in her lungs, but in her resolve. The opening note emerged softer than expected. It wasn't a dramatic flourish or a bid for immediate attention. It was controlled, intimate, almost restrained. The effect was immediate and unsettling. The room shifted. A few judges leaned forward without realizing it. The note carried texture, emotion layered beneath precision, the kind of sound that demanded listening rather than reaction. It did not announce itself. It invited the audience in. As Aaliyah continued, her voice expanded naturally, filling the space without force. Each phrase unfolded with intention, shaped by restraint rather than excess. This was not a performance designed to impress through volume or theatrics. It was built on presence, on honesty, on the refusal to contort herself into something more palatable. Margaret's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. The unexpected twist came not in a mistake, but in the audience's response. A subtle ripple moved through the room, shifts in posture, exchanged glances, a recalibration of attention. This was not the sound anyone had prepared for. It did not fit neatly into categories. It disrupted the assumptions that had framed the evening, challenging the idea that excellence required uniformity. Aaliyah felt it too. The moment when resistance in the room gave way to something else: curiosity, recognition, discomfort. She leaned into it, allowing the music to do what words could not. She sang with the accumulated weight of rejection and resilience, every note carrying the story she had been forced to live quietly. By the time she reached the final phrase, the room was completely still. No coughs, no shifting, just attention. She held the last note just long enough to let it settle, then released it gently, stepping back into silence. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The pause stretched, heavy and electric. Aaliyah stood motionless, pulse racing, unsure whether the quiet signaled judgment or something far more dangerous: impact. From the corner of her eye, she saw one judge set their pen down slowly. Another cleared their throat, not to speak, but as if grounding themselves. Margaret Holloway did not clap right away. The applause, when it came, was uneven at first. Hesitant, then grew louder, more insistent, as people realized they were responding to something they could not easily dismiss. Aaliyah did not smile. She did not bow. She simply stood there breathing, aware that the opening note she had chosen so carefully had already done what it needed to do. It had disrupted expectations. And as the applause continued, Aaliyah sensed that whatever came next, whatever decisions were made behind closed doors, would no longer be contained by tradition or comfort. The stage had shifted beneath everyone's feet, and the true reckoning was only just beginning. The applause did not settle into comfort, the way it usually did after a performance. It lingered in uneven waves, as if the room itself were unsure how to respond to what it had just experienced. Aaliyah stepped off the stage with her heartbeat still racing, the echo of her final note humming through her chest like a living thing. She could feel the shift behind her even without looking back, the recalibration of attention, the quiet disturbance of certainty. This was not the response anyone had rehearsed for. Backstage, the air felt thinner. Choir members avoided her eyes, not out of hostility but out of confusion, their confidence unsettled by something they could not name. Aaliyah caught fragments of whispered reactions as she passed, comments about tone, about restraint, about how unexpected it was. None of them said what sat beneath those words, that the performance had dismantled a story many of them had unconsciously believed, that a voice they had been told did not fit had just filled the room with something undeniable. Margaret Holloway stood near the wings, posture rigid, expression composed to the point of fragility. When Aaliyah approached, their eyes met briefly. Margaret's gaze held calculation now rather than dismissal, a careful reassessment of what could no longer be ignored. She offered a thin smile and said something neutral about the acoustics, about how the hall carried sound differently. It was an attempt to regain control of the narrative, to ground the moment in technicalities, rather than Aaliyah nodded politely and kept moving, aware that any exchange would be weighed and weaponized later. In the audience, the judges conferred quietly among themselves, their programs open, pens hovering uncertainly above the page. One of them leaned back, arms crossed, studying the stage as if replaying the performance in their mind. Another scribbled a note, then stopped as though reconsidering the language they had intended to use. The third judge looked toward the choir director's section, then back at the stage, caught between institutional expectation and professional integrity. The tension was subtle but unmistakable. Daniel watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and concern. He had seen this moment before in other contexts, the instant when excellence disrupted comfort, forcing people to choose between honesty and allegiance. He knew the danger lay not in overt rejection, but in compromise, in the ways institutions learned to absorb disruption without changing. His gaze followed the judges, reading their reactions carefully, understanding that the decision would be shaped as much by fear as by merit. As the program continued, the energy in the room remained unsettled. Performances that followed were strong, but they landed differently now, measured against a new, unspoken standard. Audience members compared notes in hushed tones, some praising the choir's cohesion, others returning again and again to the solo they hadn't expected to move them. Aaliyah sat alone near the back, hands folded in her lap, resisting the urge to replay every second of her performance. She had done what she came to do. Whatever happened next would not change that. The unexpected twist emerged during the intermission. A school administrator approached Aaliyah quietly, asking if she would be willing to step into a small conference room for a brief conversation. The request was framed as routine, but the timing was too precise to be coincidence. Inside the room, two judges waited alongside the administrator, their expressions guarded. They thanked Aaliyah for her performance, speaking in careful professional tones. One of them mentioned how her voice challenged conventional categorization, how it resisted being placed neatly into genre or expectation. Then came the question that revealed everything.
They asked where she had trained.
Aaliyah answered honestly, describing informal lessons, late-night practice, the absence of institutional support. She watched as their expressions shifted again, admiration mingling with discomfort. One judge nodded appreciatively, remarking on the authenticity that came from such a background. Another asked whether she would be open to stylistic coaching in the future, suggesting adjustments that might make her voice more adaptable for broader audiences. The implication hung heavy in the air. Excellence was acceptable, but only if it agreed to be reshaped. The administrator interjected smoothly, redirecting the conversation toward logistics and timelines. The meeting ended quickly, without conclusions, leaving Aaliyah standing alone in the hallway, with the echo of the question still ringing in her ears. Adaptable. The word felt familiar. Another version of fit dressed up in opportunity. She understood then that dismantling stereotypes was only the first step. What followed was negotiation. How much of herself she would be asked to surrender in exchange for validation. Back in the auditorium, she noticed subtle changes. Some audience members smiled at her openly now. Others avoided her gaze, uncomfortable with the way their assumptions had been exposed. A teacher she barely knew offered a quiet compliment, emphasizing how surprising the performance had been. The word landed awkwardly, praise tangled with revelation. Aaliyah accepted it without comment, increasingly aware that every reaction carried layers she did not have the energy to unpack. Margaret Holloway addressed the choir during a brief break, reminding them of professionalism and focus. Her voice was steady, but the message felt defensive, as if shoring up boundaries that had begun to crack. She spoke about standards again, about honoring tradition, but the words sounded thinner now, less absolute. Aaliyah watched from a distance, recognizing the effort it took to maintain authority when the ground beneath it shifted. As the final performances concluded, the judges withdrew to deliberate. The waiting settled into something dense and charged. Aaliyah sat with her mother, who had arrived quietly during the intermission, squeezing her hand in silent solidarity. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The outcome mattered, but it was no longer the only thing at stake. What had already happened could not be undone. When the judges returned, their expressions were carefully neutral. The head judge took the microphone, thanking everyone for their patience and praising the overall quality of the performances. The language was broad, inclusive, designed to soothe. As they began to announce recognitions, Aaliyah listened closely, reading between the words. The pauses were longer than usual, the glances exchanged between judges more frequent. Then it became clear. The panel was divided. One judge spoke enthusiastically about innovation and emotional depth, clearly referencing Aaliyah without naming her. Another emphasized consistency and cohesion, praising the choir's adherence to tradition. The third judge hesitated, weighing their words as if aware that whatever they said next would tip the balance. The disagreement was not just about scores. It was about value. Aaliyah felt the room hold its breath. The result, whatever it would be, was no longer unanimous. And as the judges prepared to announce their final decision, it was clear that her voice had done more than compete. It had forced a reckoning that could not be resolved quietly, setting the stage for consequences that would reach far beyond the competition itself. The announcement landed in the room without celebration, carried on a careful tone meant to balance enthusiasm with restraint. The judges declared Aaliyah's performance one of the highest scoring solo entries of the evening, citing emotional depth, originality, and technical control. The words were precise, measured, almost cautious, as if they feared the consequences of sounding too impressed. For a split second, the auditorium was suspended in silence, the kind that follows a truth people weren't prepared to hear spoken out loud. Then the applause came. It wasn't the thunderous roar reserved for unanimous victories. It was fragmented at first, claps breaking out in pockets, some enthusiastic, others hesitant, before swelling into something louder, more undeniable. Aaliyah felt it wash over her in waves, pride and disbelief colliding in her chest. She remained seated, hands clenched together, absorbing the moment, rather than performing gratitude for it. Around her, faces told a more complicated story than applause ever could. Some administrators smiled tightly, nodding as if this outcome had always been possible, always acceptable. Others looked stunned, their expressions betraying the internal scramble to reconcile public praise with private certainty. The discomfort was visible now, etched into posture and expression. This was not just about a score. It was about being proven wrong in a way that could not be reframed quietly. Margaret Holloway did not clap at first. She sat rigidly, eyes fixed forward, her face composed into something that resembled professionalism but lacked warmth. When she finally joined the applause, it was brief and restrained, her hands coming together with the bare minimum of motion. Those who knew her well noticed immediately. For years, her authority had gone unquestioned, her standards accepted as objective truth. Now, in a single evening, that certainty had been publicly unsettled. Whispers rippled through the audience. Parents leaned toward one another, murmuring about the performance they hadn't expected, about the way it lingered long after it ended. Students glanced between Aaliyah and the choir director, sensing the shift even if they didn't fully understand it. Recognition had a cost, and the bill was coming due. Backstage, the atmosphere was tense. Choir members moved quietly, their earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. Aaliyah passed them without comment, aware that her success had complicated their world in ways that felt personal even if they weren't. Some offered brief congratulations, genuine but cautious, as though afraid to align themselves too clearly. Others said nothing at all, their silence louder than words. Daniel found her near the exit, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. He congratulated her softly, reminding her to breathe, to stay present. He also warned her, quietly, that moments like this often triggered backlash disguised as professionalism. Institutions, he said, rarely admitted error without resistance. Aaliyah nodded, understanding that the applause was only the beginning. The cost of being proven wrong revealed itself quickly. An administrator took the microphone again, thanking everyone for their participation and emphasizing the importance of unity and respect. The speech felt unnecessary, defensive, as if meant to smooth over an imbalance that could no longer be ignored. Unity was invoked not as celebration, but as containment. Aaliyah listened carefully, hearing the subtext beneath the words. This moment would be acknowledged, but only on terms that preserved control. As the audience began to disperse, Margaret Holloway moved with purpose, intercepting a group of administrators near the stage. Her voice was low but firm, her gestures controlled. Aaliyah couldn't hear the words, but she recognized the posture. This was not reflection. This was strategy. Margaret was not grappling with bias. She was managing fallout. The unexpected twist came when a staff member approached Aaliyah with a polite but urgent request. The choir director wished to speak with her privately. The room they were ushered into was small and windowless, its neutral decor offering no warmth. Margaret stood near the table, arms folded, expression carefully neutral. An assistant lingered briefly before excusing herself, leaving the two of them alone. The silence stretched thick with everything that had gone unsaid between them since the audition. Margaret spoke first, congratulating Aaliyah on her performance. The words sounded practiced, stripped of emotion. She said it was clear the judges appreciated a certain individuality. The pause before the word was deliberate. She then shifted, suggesting that while the outcome was impressive, it did not invalidate the choir's standards or the decisions made earlier in the season. The implication was sharp. Success did not equal misjudgment. Aaliyah listened without interrupting, her expression calm. She had learned that composure was its own form of resistance. Margaret continued, her tone tightening slightly. She mentioned concerns about precedent, about how public narratives could spiral out of control if not managed carefully. She suggested it might be wise for Aaliyah to refrain from discussing internal decisions publicly, framing it as protection rather than restriction. The words landed heavily, a warning cloaked in courtesy. The threat was subtle but devastating. Margaret was offering acknowledgement, only if it came with silence. Aaliyah felt the weight of the moment settle in. This was the cost. Being proven right did not dismantle power. It provoked it. The victory on stage had exposed bias, but it had also triggered an attempt to reassert control behind closed doors. The message was clear. Recognition could be granted, but only if it did not disrupt authority further. She responded carefully, thanking Margaret for the congratulations, and stating simply that she intended to be honest about her experience, if asked. Her voice remained steady, her words measured. She did not accuse. She did not plead. She named her position, without apology. Margaret's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. She said she hoped Aaliyah understood the difference between honesty and unnecessary conflict. The sentence hung between them, sharp and deliberate. Aaliyah nodded, understanding exactly what was being offered, and what was being threatened. When the meeting ended, Aaliyah stepped back into the hallway feeling colder than before. The applause from the auditorium echoed faintly in her memory, now tangled with the reality of what it had cost. She had won recognition, but she had also been marked. The system had adjusted, but it had not surrendered. Outside, her mother waited, reading Aaliyah's face immediately. They exchanged a look that said everything words could not. This wasn't over. It was shifting. As they walked toward the exit, Aaliyah noticed Margaret speaking again, with administrators, her gestures animated now, urgency replacing composure. Decisions were being made. Narratives were being shaped. The victory that had briefly belonged to Aaliyah was already being reframed, its edges softened to fit institutional comfort. And as Aaliyah stepped out into the cold night air, applause fading behind her, she understood that the most dangerous moment wasn't rejection. It was what came after success, when those in power worked quietly to ensure that being proven wrong never happened the same way again. The days following the performance unfolded with an intensity that felt disproportionate to the quiet professionalism the school preferred to project. What had happened on stage could not be contained within the auditorium walls. Clips of Aaliyah's performance circulated beyond the initial audience, shared by parents, alumni, and music pages that framed the moment as a breakthrough rather than an anomaly. The narrative was no longer fully in the school's control, and that loss showed in how quickly administrators moved to manage it. Emails went out praising the success of the event and highlighting the school's commitment to diverse talent. The language was broad, celebratory, and careful to avoid specifics. Aaliyah read them with a growing sense of detachment. Her name appeared, but always in proximity to institutional credit, as though her achievement were evidence of a system working rather than one being challenged. The applause had been loud, but accountability arrived wrapped in deflection. Students stopped her in the hallways now, some offering congratulations that felt sincere, others tinged with curiosity about what would happen next. Teachers who had barely acknowledged her before smiled more readily, asking about her plans, her future. The shift was noticeable and unsettling. Support that appeared only after validation from outsiders felt less like growth and more like alignment. Aaliyah accepted the kindness without illusion, aware of how conditional it remained. Margaret Holloway was conspicuously absent for several days. Her absence became a subject of speculation, whispered about in faculty lounges and student group chats. Some assumed she was regrouping, others that she was being quietly questioned. When she finally returned, her demeanor was altered just enough to be noticeable. The authority remained, but it was edged with caution now, as though she were aware that every word carried new scrutiny. The unexpected twist arrived in the form of a scheduled assembly. The principal announced it abruptly, citing the need to address recent events and reaffirm the school's values. The timing was strategic. An assembly offered visibility, but also control. Aaliyah sat among her peers, heart steady but guarded, sensing that this was not about apology so much as narrative repair. The auditorium filled again, though the energy was different this time, less celebratory, more performative. On stage, the principal spoke about growth, about listening, about how moments of challenge offered opportunities for reflection. He acknowledged that decisions made earlier in the season may have felt exclusionary to some students. The phrasing was deliberate, passive, designed to acknowledge impact without admitting fault. Aaliyah listened closely, noting what was said and what was carefully avoided. There was no mention of bias, no ownership of harm, just a vague commitment to reviewing practices moving forward. Margaret was invited to speak next. She approached the microphone with visible restraint, her posture composed, her expression measured. She congratulated Aaliyah publicly, praising her unique artistry and acknowledging that her performance had broadened perspectives. The words sounded generous, but they landed hollow. There was no acknowledgement of the audition room, of the dismissal, of the phrase that had started everything. The apology, if it could be called that, was framed as evolution rather than correction. Aaliyah felt the weight of the moment press in. This was accountability arriving late, and only as loudly as reputation required. After the assembly, Daniel called, his voice tight with concern. He had seen how quickly institutions pivoted when pressure mounted, how apologies without ownership often preceded erasure. He warned Aaliyah that the next move would be critical. Public recognition could still be retracted quietly, through missed opportunities, diminished visibility, reframed narratives that celebrated talent while burying context. That afternoon, Aaliyah was summoned to the principal's office. The meeting was formal, attended by administrators and a district representative. They praised her composure, her professionalism, her contribution to the school's image. Then came the proposal. They offered to feature her in upcoming school events, including a spring showcase, positioning it as inclusion, an opportunity. But the offer came with conditions. Any public discussion of the audition process, of discrimination, of institutional bias, would need to be handled sensitively, ideally redirected toward themes of perseverance, rather than injustice. The message was unmistakable. Celebrate success, but not its cause. Aaliyah listened carefully, her face neutral. She asked whether the choir's audition criteria would be reviewed or whether students previously excluded would be invited to re-audition. The room shifted. Administrators exchanged glances. the district representative clearing his throat before responding with vague assurances about future consideration. No commitments, no timelines, just language designed to close the conversation. Her mother, who had insisted on attending, spoke next. Calmly, deliberately, she asked whether the school intended to formally acknowledge the harm caused, or simply move forward as though recognition erased responsibility. The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and undeniable. For a moment, the polished professionalism cracked, revealing the anxiety beneath. The principal responded with a careful smile, saying the school believed in positive momentum. Dwelling on the past, he suggested, could undermine progress. The statement was meant to sound hopeful. It felt dismissive. Aaliyah realized then that this meeting was not about repairing harm. It was about deciding whether her success would be integrated or minimized, whether it would be allowed to stand as evidence of bias or reframed as an exception that proved nothing. The final decision came in the form of a document slid across the table. It outlined participation agreements for future performances, media guidelines, and expectations of representation. Signing it would formalize her place within the school's narrative, on their terms. Declining would not revoke her past success, but it would quietly limit her access moving forward. Opportunities would dry up without explanation. Doors would close politely. Aaliyah stared at the paper, the weight of it settling in her hands. This was the cost made explicit. Compliance in exchange for visibility. Silence in exchange for celebration. She asked for time to consider. That evening, she sat in her room again, the same space where doubt had merely convinced her to quit. The difference now was clarity. She understood that accountability, when it came, was often loud, but incomplete, designed to preserve power rather than dismantle it. The system had adjusted just enough to survive scrutiny. Her phone buzzed with messages. Supporters encouraging her, strangers thanking her for speaking through song, others asking what she would do next. The choice before her was no longer just personal. It had implications she could not ignore. As night fell, Aaliyah held the unsigned document in her hands, fully aware that what she decided next would determine whether her success became a symbol of change, or a carefully managed footnote. And somewhere within the school's walls, administrators waited, hoping she would choose the path that made their discomfort disappear. The document remained unsigned on Aaliyah's desk as Christmas morning arrived quietly, without urgency or spectacle. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating the paper's crisp edges, its carefully chosen language still echoing in her mind. Outside, the world moved on as if nothing had shifted, as if a single performance could not possibly ripple beyond the walls that had tried to contain it. Yet Aaliyah knew better now. She had felt the tremor. Others had too. Messages continued to arrive throughout the day. Some came from students at her school, thanking her for saying what they never could, even if she had said it only through song. Others came from strangers, parents, educators, young singers, sharing stories that mirrored her own. They spoke of auditions framed as fairness, of standards used selectively, of being told they were talented but not suitable. Aaliyah read every message slowly, absorbing the realization that her experience was not an exception. It was a pattern, one that had thrived on silence. Daniel called in the afternoon, his voice steady but thoughtful. He said the performance had started conversations in circles that rarely questioned themselves. Music educators were debating the meaning of cohesion. Competition boards were reviewing blind submission policies. None of it was dramatic or immediate, but it was movement, the kind that institutions often resisted because it could not be easily controlled. He told her she had already changed the conversation, regardless of what she chose to sign. At home, her mother moved through the kitchen, with practiced calm, humming softly as she prepared dinner. A sound wrapped around Aaliyah, grounding her. This was where her voice had always mattered first, long before stages and judges. They sat together later, talking openly about what came next. Her mother didn't push her toward defiance or compliance. She simply asked what version of her Aaliyah wanted to protect. The one that survived by shrinking, or the one that lived by refusing to disappear. The school meanwhile waited. Administrators sent a follow-up email, politely checking in, reiterating the benefits of partnership. The tone was friendly, almost warm, as if time might soften the tension. Margaret Holloway remained conspicuously silent. No apology followed the assembly. No acknowledgement beyond what had already been performed for an audience. The absence spoke volumes. Some silences were louder than rejection. Aaliyah walked through the neighborhood later that evening, Christmas lights blinking around her. familiar streets carrying unfamiliar weight. She thought about the choir room, the audition, the sentence that had tried to define her limits. She thought about the stage, the opening note that had shifted a room. The contrast felt almost surreal. One voice, two outcomes. The difference had never been talent. It had been permission. The unexpected twist came not from the school, but from the competition committee. An email arrived late that night, brief but direct. They thanked Aaliyah for her participation and informed her that, due to the judges' divided decision, they had chosen to feature her performance independently on their official channels, alongside a statement about expanding definitions of excellence. The feature would not be tied to the school. It would stand on its own. No conditions, no reframing, just the performance, presented as it was. Aaliyah stared at the screen, heart pounding. This was not a trophy or a title. It was something quieter and more disruptive. Visibility without institutional mediation. Recognition that did not require silence in exchange. The opportunity existed outside the system that had tried to manage her story, and that distinction mattered. She shared the email with her mother, then with Daniel. The responses were immediate, filled with cautious optimism. This was the path that had been opening since the night she first pressed submit. A path that did not ask her to erase context to earn space. It did not promise ease, but it offered integrity. The next morning, Aaliyah returned to her desk and picked up the unsigned document. She read it once more, not with anxiety this time, but with clarity. The language felt smaller now, limited by its own need for control. She folded it neatly and placed it back into the envelope. Then, she opened her laptop and drafted a response to the school brief, respectful, firm. She thanked them for the opportunities offered and stated that she would be pursuing independent paths that aligned with her values. No accusations, no explanations, just a boundary. The reply came quickly, cordial and restrained. Best wishes, continued success. The door did not slam shut. It closed softly, the way institutions preferred when they were losing leverage. In the weeks that followed, Aaliyah's performance continued to circulate, sparking articles and discussions that named the issue directly. Race, access, belonging. Some praised her courage, others questioned her motives, uncomfortable with the way her story challenged familiar narratives. Aaliyah learned quickly that impact invited scrutiny, and scrutiny revealed more about observers than subjects. She began working with Daniel more closely, preparing for opportunities that did not require her to fit into pre-existing molds. Her voice evolved, not because it was reshaped to be acceptable, but because it was allowed to grow honestly. Each step forward carried echoes of where she had started, reminders of what it had cost to be heard. Occasionally she passed the school auditorium, its doors closed, banners still hanging from the competition. Life there had resumed its rhythm. New auditions, new promises of inclusion. Yet something subtle had changed. Students spoke more openly now. Questions were asked, where silence once stood. The system remained, but its certainty had been cracked. On a cold evening near the end of the season, Aaliyah stood in her room again. The same space where doubt had once nearly convinced her to walk away. She sang softly, not for an audience, not for validation, but because her voice still needed somewhere to land. The sound filled the room, steady and uncontained, carrying with it the truth she had fought to keep. The Christmas song that had once been dismissed as not fitting had changed more than a competition. It had exposed the fragile scaffolding beneath so-called standards. It had asked questions institutions preferred to avoid. It had reminded people that talent did not need permission to exist, only the courage to refuse erasure. And as the final note faded into the quiet, one question remained, unresolved and persistent, lingering far beyond the music itself. Who truly gets to decide where someone fits? If this story moved you, type yes in the comments. Not for her, but for every voice that was told it didn't belong. Ask yourself honestly, how many times have talent and truth been silenced because they made people uncomfortable? Subscribe to this channel to keep these stories alive, because silence is exactly what injustice depends on. We tell these stories so voices pushed to the edge are never erased again.